Good evening, everybody. Welcome on behalf of the Theosophical Society to a new lecture, The Mystic Relationship Between Disciple and Teacher. A topic that fits very well into this series about initiation because teaching plays a central role in it. In the first place, because the great initiations, as we discussed in the first lecture and also last week, they cannot take place without a teacher, a master of wisdom and compassion, who provides both the necessary training and conditions that are required for the initiation to take place. And secondly, because becoming a teacher is also the very purpose of initiation, to become a teacher for humanity in order to help and stimulate humanity in its spiritual evolution. It is the appearance of a world teacher who, after a successful return from one of the higher initiations, illuminated by his own divine nature, brings a new impulse of the universal wisdom to humanity. Teaching, therefore, is one of the defining characteristics of the hierarchy of wisdom and compassion, consisting of a cooperation of human beings, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, who expanded their consciousness and knowledge not for themselves, but for the motive of passing on this knowledge and wisdom to humanity. Out of compassion, they turn around on the inner path, sacrificing their own progress to teach those coming behind them, encouraging them to follow the same upward path. And this spiritual hierarchy, we know as the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, consists of many degrees of teachers and disciples at all levels of consciousness, like a chain of connected links through which the universal wisdom is passed from the symbolic heart of the universe to humanity. And each link in this chain is at the same time both pupil and teacher. Pupil, in the case, it is directed upwards in the stream in order to receive teachings from the further advanced, the higher beings, and teacher when what has been received is being passed on to those who are less developed. And as you can understand, this is not just an ordinary teacher-student relation as we know it in everyday life, but one that transcends it in unconditional devotion, in loyalty, in inner wisdom, making it a sacred relation that truly can be called mystic. But before we go further into this, I would like first to have a closer look at the learning process, because having a clear picture of what learning is key for understanding the relationship between teacher and disciple. Essentially, learning is the development of inner faculties that we have already latent within us, locked up within, so to speak, because if this were not the case, we would never be able to express them. So learning is not a matter of adding something from the outside, but developing, unfolding from what is already within. Dormant faculties, you can also say, that we have to activate ourselves by our own efforts. As Socrates aptly puts it, learning is not the filling of a vessel, but the kindling of a flame. Ultimately an infinite fire, so to speak, of which we are now expressing only a little spark. But we have to do the work ourselves. No one can become wise for someone else. No one can give you wisdom or insight. That is something that we 100% have to build ourselves. And if we don't do this, and we blindly accept what somebody else tells you instead, without thinking it over, without testing it, then it is simply blind faith, and you will not learn anything. But although we have to do the work ourselves, we can get help, provided it is done in the right way. And that brings us to the subject of teaching, because what is the right way? Or in other words, what characterizes a true teacher? First of all, since a true teacher knows that growth comes from within, his approach will always be focused on the development of the student's own inner qualities. And this means that he will never force, he will never impose, but always inspire. He will never constrain the student's free will by demanding him to accept something from him on the basis of authority. He will never try to persuade, but always appeal to the student's own independent thinking, so that he has the opportunity to develop his own insight and his own wisdom. Socrates therefore called himself a spiritual midwife because he helped his pupils with the birth of the soul, so to speak. And he did this by means of his famous dialogues, in which he only pointed his students in the right direction, where they could find the answers within themselves just by asking them the right questions. But in order to be such a spiritual midwife, it is essential for the teacher to be the living example himself. If he wants to awaken certain qualities in his student, he must possess or embody these qualities himself in order to make it resonate in the other. A teacher may know and instruct a great deal, but if he's not the living example himself, it will have little effect because it will not resonate. And this process of resonance works best when sender and receiver are attuned to each other. So the better the teacher is able to attune at the student's level, the better the communication and transference of what is being taught. And perhaps the most important of all is that the true teacher has the inner confidence in the student and also shows or gives this confidence to the student, knowing that all the potential is present. It may take shorter, it may take longer, but the teacher knows that which is fundamentally latent within will manifest itself eventually. And because this confidence is sincere, the student will also experience it as such, which allows the teacher to create the essential atmosphere for the student to feel completely at ease, feeling safe and free to ask or say anything without fear or making mistakes. An atmosphere in which the teacher does not reprimand, but instead helps and encourages and stimulates the student to develop his own understanding. But you might ask yourself, if everything is already essentially present within us, do we then actually need teachers? And the theoretical answer to this question would be no, everything is within us in potential. So as we gain experience and learn our lessons during our lives, it all would eventually come to expression over time, but it would take an eternity. Consider, for example, someone on a desert island who has to figure out the Earth's position in the solar system without any education. Probably he would eventually be able to manage this by his own observation, but it would take much longer than if he were to receive help with this. Without teachers, the development of our inner faculties would take ages, and so we would stay much longer ignorant, which would also imply, in a way, so much longer of suffering. And it is especially this last point that is an important reason why, out of compassion, the theosophical answer to the question is, yes, we need teachers. And moreover, from this perspective of compassion, based on the unity of everything, teaching is the most natural thing there is, for it diminishes differences and therefore brings about greater harmony. Because by teaching, the more advanced help the less advanced to keep up and to be able to follow their steps. That is why we find teaching as a universal phenomenon at all levels, from the animal kingdom, where parents teach their young how to find food, to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, of whom the scriptures mention that they also have their teachers of a still higher level, so celestial or dhyani Buddhas, who in their turn also have teachers of even higher levels, and literally so continuing into infinity. But between these two, so our inner dormant faculties and the teacher who stimulates us to awaken them, there's something special going on. For there is a close relation or interrelation between both, but in order to explain this interaction, it is important to first have a look at what we exactly are as human beings and where our latent faculties come from. Because we are more than what we in general identify ourselves with, and our inner abilities do not just emerge out of nothing, they are derived from or rooted in more inner parts of our constitution. And I will try to explain this with the use of this diagram, which represents the composite constitution of man, just as every other living being has a composite nature. And the first and most fundamental idea to keep in mind in this diagram is that we essentially are an infinite stream of consciousness, the red line that runs through the middle, having no beginning or no end, because it is boundless, because we are boundless in essence. On this line, you see different centers representing spheres of consciousness, because as a complete human being, we are composed of different spheres of influence. And each such center or sphere within us represents a specific quality or range of consciousness. And the disadvantage of a diagram is always that it is limited, because as the centers are depicted here above one another, in reality they completely permeate each other. It's important to keep in mind. So starting at the bottom, the lowest sphere represents our physical body, which we not actually are, but which we have. We have a body that we use as an instrument to express ourselves in the physical world. We also have an animal nature, the sphere just above the physical, which consists of our desires and emotions of a more instinctive nature. Very useful as an instrument to sense our surroundings, but less useful when we do not control it with our mind, resulting it to take over, for example, when we lose ourselves in emotions such as anger or fear. But this part of us already reaches beyond our physical body, because it allows us to sense the atmosphere of spaces and the emotional states of others. And we can also recognize this ability of sensing from a distance in animals. For example, when you have to go to the vet with your cat and suddenly he's nowhere to be found because he senses it, or he senses exactly what is intended to happen. Then we have our everyday thoughts, our tendencies, desires and ideals as grown human beings. This is what we express in our current stage of evolution, what we call I as thinking beings, assigning reality to the emotions and the thoughts related to the physical world we live in and we identify ourselves with. But then it gets interesting, because further up or further within ourselves, we also have further developed centers of consciousness, which we are too in essence, only not yet self-consciously. Just as our organs and cells have their being within our human sphere of consciousness, we are part of more developed, further advanced consciousness, which we collectively refer to as our higher self. And this higher self, again, consists of three centers or spheres, beings who have developed an increased range of consciousness, with also a corresponding increased wisdom and awareness of unity. And the first of these three, which we call the inner teacher, has a range or circle of influence that encompasses the entire inner planet, which concerns much more than our physical globe, because our living planet, just like us, consists of different inner spheres. Then the next above or within is our inner Buddha, who has a range of consciousness that encompasses the entire solar system. Again, not the physical planets, but the entire inner life of the solar system, the soul of it, you can say. And finally, our inner God, the highest, most universal part of us that encompasses the entire inner galaxy. And as such, links us with the boundlessness, because our stream of consciousness continues and never ends. What important to realize is that as evolving human beings, we are constantly within the sphere of influence of our higher self, and therefore able to become aware of this influence. All our noble and ethical qualities, such as compassion, understanding, insight in the unity and interconnectedness of life, our conscience, they are all reflections on our human level, originating from these inner parts of ourselves. In their own realm, they are fully active, consciously radiating their influence, but it is us, as developing human beings who are still asleep, so to speak, not yet able of being self-consciously aware of it, identifying with it, and expressing these inner qualities. And when we talk about learning, about growth or evolution, the unfolding of inner faculties, it's exactly this what we need to do, to awaken our, or activate within ourselves these qualities of our higher self that our higher self already expresses. So coming back now to the interaction I just mentioned between the teacher and our yet dormant faculties, it is the inner teacher of our higher self that plays a key role in this. When we talk about the mystical relation between disciple and teacher, the outer teacher, our inner teacher has everything to do with it. So how does that work? First of all, I wrote outer teachers on the slide in plural, because there are different types of outer teachers, each of whom plays a specific role at different moments in this interaction, depending on the disciple's stage of development on the path, as we will see later on. But first I would like to share the following two quotes. When the materials are all prepared and ready, the architect shall appear. And when the pupil is ready, the teacher is waiting. Two quotes that express the same mystical idea, which has everything to do with the interaction between the inner and the outer teacher. When the pupil is ready, the teacher is waiting. The question then is, of course, when is the student ready and what is the teacher waiting for? And Catherine Tingley, the third leader of our organization, says the following about this. A teacher may endeavor to impart the truth, but if the intuition of the pupil is not developed, or at least to a degree, the effort is useless. For intuition is the real, the mystic teacher. In other words, there must be first a certain receptivity developed by the pupil before the teacher can begin to teach. The so-called materials in the quote must be prepared first before the architect can start working with it. And this is not the case until the disciple has, to a certain extent, established an active connection with his own inner teacher. For this receptivity is related to the degree to which we have developed our intuition or buddhi, which, as Tingley says, is the true mystical teacher. Because it is our inner teacher or higher self where these flashes of insight and wisdom originate from the moment we have an active connection with it. This must first take place before the student is ready to be taught in the deeper teachings. You must first develop the faculty of understanding before you are able to understand, before you can receive and comprehend the mysteries of the universe. But how does this work? How do we actively connect with our inner teacher? And then we come to the first type, so to say, of outer teachers, which is the world teacher, as opposed to the second type we will say later on, which is the individual teacher of the disciple. For it is initially this general or universal teacher of humanity who plays an important role in helping us to self-consciously connect with our inner teacher. De Bouke, one of the leaders of our organization, says the following about this. As regards the average man, he whose progress is not yet sufficient to have awakened with him the spiritual and psychical senses and faculties, which not only merit, but which will indeed command the aid of a superior teacher, there is always the wisdom of the great sages and seers of the ages. That is, the great teachers of the various world religions and philosophies, who, as messengers of the Lord of wisdom and compassion, show the average man the inner path that leads to a self-conscious connection with our own inner teacher. And how do they do this? Firstly, by presenting us the universal wisdom, such as reincarnation and karma, the fact that we are not our body, but consciousness, infinite in essence, the fact that there is a fundamental unity and all life is interconnected. And by revealing universal truths like these, the world teachers make an appeal to the higher or inner parts of ourselves where this wisdom is already residing. And secondly, by presenting and embodying the virtues and the rules of conduct deriving from this wisdom, by which they appeal to the moral and the ethical aspects within us, which are essential in becoming able to perceive the influence of our inner teacher. And regardless whether you take the virtues of the Greek Stoics or the paramitas of Buddhism, the virtues of Christianity or Islam, they all concern the same qualities: compassion, selflessness, justice, courage, patience, self-control, forgiveness, all qualities within that bring us in active resonance with our inner teacher. And why is this? Because these are all qualities that belong to our inner selves. They raise or expand our consciousness by shifting our focus from our personal self to our higher self. In the first lecture of this series, we defined the characteristics of a chela, a disciple on the path, as a growing indifference to oneself and an increasing interest in all that is. And that is exactly why the living of this, that is exactly where the living of these virtues leads to. In this context, the Bouke mentions two virtues in particular, of which the application or living is a prerequisite for the aspiring pupil to make himself suitable for chelaship. And the first is never justify yourself. If people followed this rule in the world, our earth would be a paradise compared to what it is now, says the Bouke. It is not an easy rule, but it is one of the most effective ways to make your personality, that part of us that is self-centered, less dominant. When you justify yourself, you put the emphasis on yourself, on trying to convince others that it is not you but somebody else who is wrong, which reinforces your sense of separateness and narrows your consciousness. Whereas the whole point is to shift your attention from yourself to the world around you, identifying with it and expand your consciousness. And that is why the second virtue or practice is so important, and that is learn to live, forgive and learn to love. Because that is the best way to shift your focus from yourself to the other. Learning to forgive has everything to do with forgetting yourself and the willingness to really understand the other. To forgive and to love is to understand. It allows you to distinguish between the act and the one who committed the act, because you understand that the other is always more than just the act, more than what he showed of himself at that particular moment. True forgiveness and impersonal love enables you to recognize the inner man behind the act, which cultivates understanding and compassion. So what does this all have to do with the inner teacher? That is that applying this wisdom and these virtues leads to the transformation process that is necessary for the influence of the inner teacher to become an active force in us. As long as we put ourselves first, following our selfish desires and tendencies, we close ourselves off for that influence. For example, when we are not able to forgive and remain stuck in resentment or anger, constantly feeding those negative thoughts, then we literally surround ourselves with these narrowing thoughts, forming a barrier that prevents us from receiving the influence of the inner teacher. Because, as mentioned, this influence is always there, but it is up to us to attune ourselves to it. And to the extent that we are able to forget ourselves in service to others, our atmosphere opens, our surrounding veils become more transparent, so to speak, which allows the inner influence to come through. Then our consciousness opens up, allowing the inner light of our higher self to shine within us. And that is the moment when the second type of outer teacher comes into the picture, the individual teacher of the disciple, who is automatically attracted or called upon when the inner light of the disciple's own higher nature begins to manifest itself. In the before mentioned quote from the Peruker, he was speaking about the developing of inner faculties which not only merit but which will indeed command the aid of the superior teacher. And the latter, so this commanding, is because it is an occult law. You can say that the teacher must respond to this inner call. And that brings us back to this dynamic interaction between the outer teacher and the inner teacher, but this time brought about by the active presence of the inner teacher. So where initially the general or world teacher encourages us to live the virtues and the qualities of our higher self, or the inner teacher, it is the present influence of the inner teacher, now this connection is active, that causes the disciple's individual teacher to appear, or the guru of the chela, as this relationship between teacher and disciple is called on this spiritual or mystic level. For this inner light of the awakened intuition is also called the Buddhic light. And about this Buddhic light, it is said that the great teachers of humanity constantly and carefully keep watch over it to light up in someone. Symbolically, this is represented as a world map with all humanity on it as little electrical points, like a spiritual dial. And each time this Buddhic light manifests itself in someone, it shows on this mystic dial as a flash of light. And even if it is only a faint glow, the moment it is present, that person is observed, and it is the teacher's duty to respond, always ready to foster and to cultivate these flashes. As a law of nature, the teacher is attracted to it on the basis of a magnetic spiritual sympathy. And that is why the earlier quotation refers to the pupil not only deserving the help of a higher teacher, but in fact also commanding it. It is the so-called right knock on the door of the teacher's heart, consisting of devotion and impersonal love, a knock that will infallibly be heard and answered because the heart of the teacher is always listening. And from this moment on, the disciple comes under the watchful eye of his outer teacher, but initially being unaware of it, because first there's a period of probation for the disciple before he is officially accepted as a chela. But in the background, the teacher is already at work, watching over the inner flame, so to speak, fostering it, stimulating the compassion that has awakened in his pupil. But of course, always fully respecting his free will, because as mentioned, the teacher never forces, but only inspires. And during this process, in which the disciple continues his progress under the watchful eye of his teacher, making sure he uses his developing faculties to serve humanity, the connection builds stronger until finally the moment arrives when the outer teacher actually appears to his disciple. That is to say, the chela is able to recognize his guru, for the guru always was there, only not apparent for his disciple. For there must be a certain degree of inner awakening before the disciple is able to recognize his outer teacher as such at all. Because you cannot recognize what you have not yet developed within yourself. Not until you have become it, you are able to see it in others. The man who is really great inside recognizes grandeur in other men and bows to it because he himself is inwardly a great man, says the Peruker. Cultivate within your own selves love, and you will understand the love that he will give you. Cultivate within your own heart's forgiveness, and you will understand the forgiveness that will flow forth from him to you. Be truthful, and you will recognize truthfulness when he comes. This is what makes the relationship between disciple and teacher a mystic one, as it is based on this inner recognition field for the average person's perception, because it concerns inner faculties of a spiritual, ethical quality that can only be recognized by the disciple who has developed these qualities within himself. It is a mystical relationship based on inner greatness, on unconditional devotion, loyalty, and a shared compassion for all that lives. A relation that is said to be infinitely more sacred even than that of parent and child, because while the parents give the body to the incoming soul, the teacher brings forth that soul itself. The teacher is, so to speak, the spiritual parent of the pupil, providing the inner nourishment to become the divinity he is in its inmost being. And when this process, so the birth of the soul, is intensely accelerated, we speak of initiation. And all the teachings the disciple receives are in fact a training and a preparation for the trials he will meet during initiation, the moment he is completely left alone by himself to prove his inner strength. In the first lecture of this series, we explained that there are 7 great initiations, the first 3 of which are also called preparatory initiations, because they consist of a combination of study and application in daily life, in which the disciple must demonstrate that he possesses the necessary discipline and ethical qualities before the 4 great initiations can be entered. And it is initially on this level of this outer physical life that the teacher monitors the pupil's progress, his willingness to actually use and apply the qualities he developed for the benefit of humanity, regardless the consequences for himself. That is what he's being tested for. And there you immediately see the relativity of the concept of teacher and disciple, because the disciple's duty to serve humanity and to pass on what he has received also means being a teacher himself at the same time. The moment a disciple is accepted as a chela, he becomes an active helping force in the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, where he starts functioning in passing on the universal wisdom. And when you read the Mahatma letters to APCnet, you get a good impression of how this works, how their chelas are constantly carrying out instructions and tasks in their commitment to serve humanity. And where you might expect strict guidance in the initial phase of these 3 initiations, the teacher gives his pupil the free rein in a way, which may sound strange, but giving him this freedom, the teacher ensures that the discipline and devotion come from within and is not being imposed on the disciple. It is the best way for the disciple to demonstrate that he is capable to overcome the trials on his own strength, that he can withstand all the temptations of daily life without any help. For this specifically, the temptations and the challenges of everyday life in which the chela must demonstrate his strength of character and which reveal his true nature. In their letters, the masters say the following about this: we allow our candidates to be tempted in 1,000 various ways, so as to draw out the whole of their inner nature and allow it the chance of remaining conqueror either one way or another. We never guide our chelas, the most advanced even, nor do we forewarn them, leaving the effects produced by causes of their own creation to teach them better experience. And in this last quote, it also becomes clear that these trials are not placed on the path by the masters, but come from within the disciple himself, because they are the karmic consequences of causes that he himself created in the past and that now suddenly come to expression accelerated the moment the Chela has made the inner decision to devote himself in the service of humanity. And it is this acceleration of karma that I compared in the first lecture of this series to cycling and air resistance. The faster you cycle, the more resistance you will experience. And this physical phenomenon also implies on the inner level, the more intense and sincere the pupil's desire to live for humanity, the faster his karmic consequences will come upon him. The inner light that starts to shine awakens, so to speak, the dormant seeds that now suddenly come to sprout altogether, all the negative characteristics, but also all the positive ones with which he is able to conquer the negative. These are the trials the disciple must face on the path. And it is always in his relation to others that he is tested, always on selfishness and compassion. The challenge to remain calm and helpful in any situation. And as long as even the slightest bit of irritation, jealousy, or resentment arises in him, it is proof that he has not yet fully mastered his lower nature and therefore not yet ready for the next step of receiving deeper teachings and entering the higher initiations. An important part of this training in selflessness is the cooperation with his fellow disciples. A Chela must completely subordinate his own interest to that of the group, that in totality must work together like the fingers of one hand in order to be a useful instrument for the teacher. Only when the disciples work together in complete harmony, they form the living channel for the teacher through which the universal wisdom can have its beneficent influence in the world. In the booklet The Voice of the Silence, dedicated to the Chela on the inner path, Madame Blavatsky writes that disciples who have chosen to sacrifice their own nirvanic bliss for humanity, ready to receive further teachings by the teacher, can be compared to the strings of the Veena. It's a stringed instrument which must be in harmony with each other, fully attuned to the teacher's mind. And that when this is not the case, the string that is not in harmony breaks and is cast away. In other words, the student who is unwilling to give himself to the greater good is expelled, or expels himself, better said, from the mystery school. And no exceptions are made in this regard. A disciple cannot expect any favors from the teacher in this matter, but bears full responsibility for it. And in this context, Blavatsky states in one of her articles on Chelaszip that the Mahatmas are the servants and not the arbiters of the law of karma. They cannot and even wish not to intervene in the karmic consequences of the disciples' actions, because that would undermine the entire purpose of the trial, which is all about the Chela to demonstrate his inner strength and his infallible moral compass. And as the Chela progresses on the inner path, passing his trials successfully, taking on increasingly greater responsibilities, the inner relation with his teacher becomes also stronger. And gradually their connection grows on this inner spiritual level, the mystic relation it is based on. Until a certain point, their minds are so much attuned, their thinking almost becoming one, that a direct communication and instruction can take place on the inner realm without the need for spoken or written words. On our level, we all know the experience of being with a family member or a close friend needing just a single word to understand each other, or the situation that you start saying the exact same thing at the exact same time to each other because you are on the same wavelength, so to speak. And even over greater distances, if it sometimes happens that you think of someone you haven't seen for a while, and at that very moment that person calls you. I think everyone knows examples like this, which shows that you can be so attuned to each other that you can pick up on each other's impressions, which is actually quite logical because we are simply interconnected. However, there's a fundamental difference between these examples and the mode of communication of the guru and his chela. Firstly, in the case of the average person, this phenomenon occurs randomly, unconsciously, and uncontrolled, whereas in the case of the teacher and his chela, it is completely controlled and based also on mutual agreement. And the second difference is that in case of the average person, this communication generally is restricted to the emotional level, being experienced as a hunch, while the communication between the teacher and his chela is crystal clear, taking place on that higher mental level. Due to his training and concentration, the disciple is able to fully attune his consciousness to the same level of purity, to the same spiritual frequency as his teacher, enabling the teacher to transmit his thoughts directly to the disciple's mind, regardless the physical distance between them. And because this stream of thoughts is of such a pure quality, transcending the everyday emotions and desires, there's no distortion or interference that could influence this transmission. An example of this process is the compilation of the secret doctrine, in which Madame Blavatsky did physically write, but which was dictated to her on the inner plane by her master. And as Blavatsky herself said, she was just the writing machine, writing down what was dictated to her on the inner planes. Another example is the Mahatma letters from the same masters, which were written in a similar way in most cases, whereby they transferred their thoughts directly to the minds of their chelas, who accordingly wrote them down. Lastly, I would like to say something about the responsibility of the teacher towards his pupil, but also of the pupil towards his teacher, because he too has a responsibility. To start with the teacher, upon who rests a great responsibility the moment he accepts and starts teaching his chela, because he becomes responsible for all the karmic consequences resulting from the esoteric teachings that he imparts on the disciple. And as has become clear, this is not about intellectual knowledge or facts, but about the deeper mysteries of the innate forces in nature and man, which, when they are wrongly understood or wrongly used, are dangerous for both the disciple himself and those around him. And therefore, it is the teacher's duty to know his chela inside out and to watch his progress closely, which is something the pupil offers himself for in this mystic relation. Otherwise, the teacher, of course, would have no right to study him. But it is the teacher's duty to, let's say, penetrate behind the veils of his pupil's personality, because nothing of the inner life can remain hidden for the teacher. Based on the qualities developed by the pupil on the one hand, and possible weakness that are still present or play a role on the other, the teacher must constantly judge what he can teach and when his pupil is ready for the next step. And he does so, as the Peruker says, with entire harmony and in rigid accord with the intimations arising in the chela's own consciousness of the presence of the inner teacher, which present themselves as sudden flashes of intuition and understanding. But the disciple, in his turn, also has a great responsibility towards his teacher, lying in the fact that regardless his unconditional loyalty and devotion to the teacher, he will never accept anything from him blindly. Despite their complete mutual trust, the pupil will always have to test for himself what he has been taught. For learning, as we started this lecture, is the development of inner faculties, and true understanding, therefore, always comes from within. The disciple will therefore always have to test for himself what the teacher presents to him in order to build his own insight and to prevent it to becoming a dogma. And this requires a continuous watchfulness and independent effort on the part of the disciple. And what the teacher actually does by being the living example himself is provide a pure atmosphere in order to bring his pupil into a corresponding resonance so that he is able to find the answers at that same level within himself from his own inner teacher, the real mystic teacher, as Tingli said. One of the first rules taught to the chela is never to ask questions before first trying to solve it himself. He will always have to think for himself first and try to find the answer. Because this is exactly the effort needed, the necessary training to develop his own intuition. There's no other way. And if it concerns a sincere question arising from his heart, and the chela takes the time to meditate on it, then the answer often will also come from within. But when this is not the case, and after intense contemplation, the chela asks his question to the teacher, then the teacher is obliged to give an answer. But this answer will always be in accordance with the quality and the clarity of the question. For the pupil does not have the right to receive mysteries of which he himself has no intuitive idea already. Hence the mystic saying or paradox that the disciple is the master and the teacher the servant, because ultimately it is the disciple himself who, based upon his motives and dedication, determines what the teacher is able and entitled to teach him. This is what I wanted to share this evening. Next week we will end the series with the lecture Initiations, not an end but a means. And then Barend Vorm will talk about the journey of the initiate during some of the great initiations. So we hope to see you next week. Now we first have a break of 3 minutes, after which you can ask your question during the break in the chat or via questions@blavatskyhouse.org. And then we will continue with a study on Zoom, which is not recorded, not broadcast. So if you want to join this study, you can still send an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org. And then we see you in the study. But first, a break of 3 minutes. Hi, Annie. Did we receive any questions?
No, no questions. I think a lot of thoughts to think about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, then we wait a second for the study. So I would like to close the evening. Thank you everybody for your contribution. And hope to see you all next week when Barend continues with the last lecture of the, where's the title? Yeah, thank you, Aad. Initiations, not an end but a means. And then all the aspects of the previous 3 come together. So please join us next week. And then we close as always with the Gayatri. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection stimulated by thine own radiant light.